The very first video I ever made was not the first one I uploaded, and I don't remember why. It was about the Ferdinand tank destroyer and not very good. At least, I assume. I didn't go back and actually watch it out of the fear that the sheer amount of cringe I would experience might actually kill me. But I think I always kind of knew that it wasn't great and I'd eventually redo it because ever since then, I've saved every photo, video, and bit of information I've run across on the Ferdinand to maybe one day use in a remake. So here's hopefully a much better video on... This video is sponsored by World of Warships, a free-to-play online multiplayer naval combat game featuring over 500 destroyers, cruisers, battleships, aircraft carriers, and submarines, which are my personal favorite, that you can command across 40 maps in 7 different game modes, and dock in 23 different ports. I know that's not a gameplay point, but look at them, they're just neat, including the biggest naval icons of the 20th century that you can command, upgrade, manage, and even customize, unless you're a loser like me and can't bring yourself to do it because, that's not what it really looked like. Each class offers a unique gameplay experience, such as charging in and weaving between enemies in a speedy destroyer, sniping from afar and tanking in a battleship, or carefully planning air attacks from a carrier to avoid a late war pilot moment. Sign up via the link below and use code BRAVO to receive 7 days of premium, 1.5 million credits, 500 doubloons, in your choice of the USS Phoenix, light cruiser Kuma, or battleship Corbeil, and either the HMS Wakeful or Italian battleship Dante Alighieri after completing 10 battles. That's invite code BRAVO. Thank you to World of Warships. The Ferdinand story actually begins with the French. Specifically, the German military's fear of dealing with their fortifications and heavy tanks in the mid-1930s that began a heavy tank development program by the 6th Department of the Army Ordnance Office, responsible for vehicle design and testing for the Wehrmacht. It took them over a year to set the tank's design requirements, before development in detail was handed off to the Henschel Company for the chassis and Krupp for the turret. In between those contracts being placed, the tank received its official classification, a long word I'm not even going to try, meaning breakthrough vehicle. The idea being a heavily armored tank used to punch through a strong enemy defensive line and hold the gap while other vehicles rush through to exploit the breach. Several prototypes were built in the following years, but none were accepted into service due to disagreements over weight. The designers favored heavy armor for the tank's specialized role, while the Panzerwaffe wanted a faster tank capable of crossing bridges. Then, in 1940, France fell without Germany deploying the breakthrough tank they needed to invade France with. The project narrowly avoided cancellation, but little progress was made over the next year. As that was going on, automotive engineer and electricity enjoyer Ferdinand Porsche, yeah, that one, was appointed chairman of the newly created Panzer Commission in September of 1939. This was a sort of advisory board of industrial engineers created by Fritz Todt and Hitler personally to determine design requirements on future tank projects. You may be wondering why that sounds exactly like what Department 6 of the Army Ordnance Office did, and that's because it is. The Panzer Commission was created to cut the Army out of the tank design process and give Hitler final say on the matter, and their first task was to design a breakthrough tank, since the Army still hadn't managed one after almost 4 years of work. Unlike those nerds at Henschel stuck in development hell requiring Army approval for every design choice they made, Porsche had complete freedom with his tank design, and while this was much faster, the tank he produced, specifically its powertrain, does kind of make a case for having more voices in the room. Porsche was a big advocate for a gas-electric drive he invented back in 1901, and put it on every vehicle he possibly could after that, including this one. Now, I am not a mechanic, and I would be lying if I said I fully understood the intricacies of the Porsche tank propulsion system, but the general idea is that a combustion engine is used to power an electric generator, and its electrical output powers a motor that actually moves the vehicle. All in all, this isn't a terrible idea, and could definitely be made to work in a tank. It had actually been done once already to some success. The powertrain just has to be strong enough to handle the weight. It is, however, way more complex than anything found in German tanks at the time, meaning the trade-off of this system was a much smaller margin of error in the design and manufacturing process. Only one running hull was ever completed of this first tank, as the project was cancelled after Hitler personally handed down new heavy tank specifications in May 1941 for both ongoing heavy tank programs that rendered current designs obsolete and demanded that 6 prototypes from Porsche and Henschel be available for trials by the summer of 1942. Then, right after that, on June 22nd, the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, and the army, who had been ambivalent on the whole heavy tank thing for the past year, suddenly decided that, yeah, we're gonna need that breakthrough tank after all. Like, immediately, please. This began the Tiger program, which is often viewed as a direct competition between the two companies and their respective design bureaus for the best design, and it kind of was, but also kind of wasn't. The Porsche and Henschel companies obviously would rather their Tiger be the Tiger, so that they could receive production contracts and make money. The real stakes, however, were above them, with the Panzer Commission out to prove itself, and the Army Ordnance Office, who had to more or less justify their existence now after working on this thing going on 6 years with no results. They were also very aware of Porsche's, I'll go with exotic design for his tank's powertrain, and fearing complications, wanted to keep it far away from the Army's repair depots and logistics lines. The official plan, though, was to get tanks to the front lines as soon as possible by producing both models at the same time at the moment either company felt they could, with the first deliveries hopefully arriving by May of 1942. Porsche and Henschel, aware of the urgent need, adapted a lot of their Tiger's designs from current projects. However, Porsche had a significant advantage in doing that. His first tank already had fairly heavy armor and mounted the Tiger's required gun, so relatively few design changes were needed to transition from the Type 100 to the Porsche Tiger. Henschel, meanwhile, had to design more or less an entirely new tank, as their existing prototype was much further from the Tiger Hitler envisioned because of prior army restrictions. In July of 1941, before assembling a prototype or the finalizing of design drawings, the Army Armaments Office placed multiple contracts for subcomponents and armor sets to build 100 Porsche Tigers at the Nibelungenwerk factory complex in Austria. While this sounds unwise, it was actually not unusual for the Tiger program, because just a few months later, the Armaments Office ordered production of 100 Henschel Tigers as well in early 1942, before a prototype of that tank had been built either. Despite this enthusiastic support, the first couple Tigers were slow to materialize, with both Porsche and Henschel finishing their first tanks literally days before a planned demonstration for Hitler April 20th. While this wasn't a formal test, both tanks suffered multiple mechanical problems, not performing as hoped. Also, Hitler made a point to praise Porsche constantly while ignoring Henschel. This isn't an important detail, I just found this paragraph very funny. The demonstration would kind of mark the beginning of the end for the Porsche Tiger, though. While it was Hitler's choice of the two, Henschel's tank was favored by basically everyone else involved in Army adoption of vehicles, exemplified by an additional production order for 200 Tigers just a few days later. After a bad showing at an actual Army trial July 3rd, even Hitler began to come around and endorse the Henschel Tiger, a platoon of which would be the first to see combat of the two vehicles in August near Leningrad. After an inquiry in September, Tiger P production was paused October 14th, pending a comparison trial between the two models. This was probably just a formality from the Army's point of view, though, because 7 days later, the OKW officially designated the Henschel firm as the source of the Panzer VI Tiger tank. The trials took place in November, and the results showed that both tanks were kind of disasters with constant breakdowns. Probably to the horror of the Army Ordnance Office, hoping to clearly demonstrate that they designed the better tank and should always be left alone to do so in the future. That said, the Porsche Tiger was unreliable to the point of halting production, while Henschel was at least building tanks that could break down on the Eastern Front. With both production lines drawing from similar sources, it made more sense at this point to invest solely in the one that was producing more vehicles, and the Porsche Tiger was officially cancelled on November 22nd, 1942, with 10 tanks and 64 hulls from Krupp completed. While total Henschel victory was fantastic news to Army Ordnance, it was the opposite for Porsche's subcontractors, who had already invested heavily in production lines to make parts for the now cancelled tank. Luckily for them, this had already been considered, and a decision on what to do with the outstanding vehicles was approved on November 22nd. To get more anti-tank guns to the army since invading the Soviet Union, the Stug 3 had been actively shifted from an infantry support role to a tank destroyer over the past year with excellent results against enemy armor. To double down on that success, it was decided to build the remaining 90 hulls as Ferdinand heavy tank destroyers, evolving that capability while fulfilling the contracts already placed. You often hear one of the big reasons for the Porsche Tiger being cancelled was because the electric generators required a lot of copper to manufacture and there was a shortage. Personally though, this sounds like an exaggeration by the army to aid in burying the project. Because if this was really a problem, Germany probably wouldn't have gone on to build 90 more of these things. Also, this production run of Ferdinand's is sometimes described as a conversion, but I think that's kind of misleading. The armored hulls required quite a few changes to swap the placement of the engine and fighting compartments, along with the addition of metal plates to double the armor thickness. But that was the only part really converted. Everything else was either carried over from the tank like the running gear or newly built like the superstructure. It did retain the petrol-electric drive, but swapped out the Tiger's Porsche-designed engines, which they could never really get working right, for Maybach engines that are proven capable on other tanks already. Time of construction though, this was the heaviest fighting vehicle ever built, so it was still to be seen if they were fully up to the task. Initially, final assembly was assigned to Alket because of their experience building assault guns. However, by February, all assembly was moved to Newark, and Alket only built the first two pilot models, both of which were grabbed the second they were finished by our old friends at Army Ordnance for evaluation. As you'd probably guess, they weren't thrilled about this project, and were already releasing reports detailing mechanical issues found in the Porsche Tiger during tests conducted after the November cancellation to discourage the whole thing. Now, to be fair, the test reports do list a horrifying number of legitimate mechanical issues. However, the number of tests conducted, and the pettiness of some of the complaints squeezed in with the real ones, does suggest quality assurance maybe wasn't their sole motivator. Newark handed over Ferdinand's as they came out of the factory to their crews of the newly created Heavy Tank Destroyer Battalions 653 and 654 of the 656th Heavy Tank Destroyer Regiment, receiving the final vehicle May 8, 1943. 3 months prior, a test report had already declared them not fit for frontline service, citing a list of mechanical failures caused by design flaws. Unfortunately for the crews though, the war situation required all vehicles, fit or not, present at the front, and on the 9th of June, the Ferdinand crews loaded their vehicles onto trains going east to join the 1943 German summer offensive. Ferdinand was one of 3 new armored wonder weapons sent east that summer to cut off and destroy 5 Soviet armies in the Kursk salient and give the Germans a much-needed strategic victory. When they arrived, the 656th was attached to the 41st Panzer Corps of the 9th Army to be part of Army Group Center's southern offensive thrust from Morel as part of the armored spearhead supporting 3 infantry divisions, and assisted themselves by 2 Stug battalions, a Sturmpanzer battalion, and 2 companies of Borgward 4 radio-controlled mine-clearing vehicles. Their first major objective was to penetrate the Soviet defensive lines and occupy a small town called Ponyury to capture a key station on the Orel-Kursk rail line. The first day's assaults were immediately blunted by Soviet artillery that made clearing the minefields extremely difficult. 653 lost 12 Borgwards clearing paths for the tanks, but incoming shells prevented combat engineers from marking them, and artillery impacts churned up the ground, erasing any track marks left from the clearing. Out of options, 653 crews had to advance using their best guess of where to go, and dozens of Ferdinands were disabled by mines. Once through, the surviving vehicles formed armored wedges and after 10 hours of fighting, broke through the first Soviet defensive line, with 12 of their 45 Ferdinands still operational at the end of the day. 654 was less successful, losing 4 radio tanks in a friendly minefield before the assault began, and 2 more to direct hits by Soviet artillery, leaving enough vehicles to only clear 1 lane through the enemy mines. Their assaults made it to the first Soviet defensive line, but stopped short of a breakthrough before the day's end. The experience day one really set the tone for the battle, and for the next 3 days, whatever operational Ferdinands the regiment had took part in slow, grinding assaults towards Ponyary Station, as repair depots worked overtime to fix the rest. July 8th, 653 reports that it must halt combat operations for a recovery day, as the battalion has no operational Ferdinands, mostly due to breakdowns and some from battle damage. The next day, 6 Ferdinands from 654 opened a route to Ponyary Station with the 78th Sturm Division, but were halted by Soviet artillery before they could exploit the breach. July 10th, German units around Ponyary were reorganized and assaults were pointed at new objectives to help facilitate a breakthrough, but Soviet defenses hold. The 11th, 653 helped fight off a counterattack by an entire Soviet tank corps, after which the German assaults accomplished very little. The day after was the start of Operation Kutuzov, the Soviet offensive on the northern front of the Ural salient that permanently halted offensive actions by Army Group Center for Operation Citadel. Facing a potential disaster, Model sent all available units to reinforce his northern flank, including the Ferdinands of the 656th, which gave the tank destroyers their first opportunity to fight in the role they were actually designed for. With their long gun and thick armor in a good position, the Ferdinands were able to pick off Soviet tanks with impunity, often before the enemy guns were even in range to shoot back, and quickly earned a reputation among Red Army tank crews. The regiment helped hold the line in fighting retreats as the Germans evacuated the Ural salient. By the time they withdrew to Bryansk by rail, every Ferdinand in the regiment was in desperate need of serious repairs after over a month of constant combat. And 656 Command begged their superiors for significant time off the line for maintenance. Their request was finally granted August 18th, when the regiment was ordered to the Dnipropetrovsk industrial facility in Ukraine for a total overhaul of their surviving vehicles. Because of their losses at Kursk, the regiment was also consolidated, and 654 transferred their remaining 19 Ferdinands to 653 before the move south. The crews were sent to France for training on Jagdpanthers and would spend the rest of the war on the Western Front. The Ferdinand's refit was interrupted before the entire battalion even reached the depot by Soviet offensives towards the Dnieper River that restarted the revolving deployment of operational Ferdinands to the front. Now part of Army Group South, combat-ready Ferdinands were sent to the Zaporozhye bridgehead as a mobile reserve in mid-September, and again saw almost constant combat for the next 2 months while the repair work continued. November 10th, the entire regiment was repositioned to defend the Nikopol bridgehead, where the Ferdinands did probably their best anti-tank work of the war while occupying the heights east of the river against a series of Soviet assaults over the next few weeks. Early December, the Ferdinands were finally cleared to return to Niewerk in Austria for a factory-level overhaul. As the first group of vehicles boarded trains for transport west, the Soviet offensive towards the Nikopol bridgehead trapped a pocket of Germans on the east bank of the Dnieper that pulled 656 back onto the front line one more time. A handful of still operational Ferdinands were folded into Kampfgruppen to evacuate the trapped infantry. First providing fire support from the west bank of the river, the vehicles crossed for the breakout itself on a 1,000-ton ferry, and after the rescue, managed to return to the German side Christmas Day 1943 without losing a single vehicle. The crewmen that took part in the operation were decorated by General Schörner personally, before finally boarding trains back to Austria, arriving January 10th, 1944 to begin the refit. German reports on the effectiveness of the Ferdinand were mixed. If it got to combat, it was a fantastic machine to fight with. The gun could outrange anything the enemy had, and with no documented penetrations to the frontal armor, the Ferdinand was pretty much impervious to incoming shells while facing the enemy. Compared to vehicle losses, casualties amongst the crews were very light thanks to the vehicle's armor, something they showed great appreciation for and mentioned regularly in their reports. Getting to combat was really the problem, as reports from crews, command, and Porsche reps in the field showed. The number of mechanical issues the vehicles encountered is just incredible. Not a single system within the tank really worked reliably, from the powertrain to the gun sight, and this kept the majority of Ferdinands out of action for the entirety of the deployment, severely limiting the regiment's tactical and operational flexibility. For example, in the lead-up to the retreat from Ural to Bryansk, the regiment's command begged their superiors for rail transport west, knowing that a road march all but guaranteed the loss of every Ferdinand in the regiment to Soviet capture after breaking down. While the entire list of issues couldn't possibly be fixed during the refit at the factory, a point was made to address a few of the big ones. Namely the poor visibility, the engine gratings being a weak spot for artillery fragments, and the lack of a close defense machine gun. The Ferdinand not having a machine gun is described as an utterly baffling choice that led to unnecessary vehicle losses at Kursk in almost everything I read for this video. But personally, I don't really see it that way. The designers not including one actually makes a lot of sense. None of the tank destroyers that predated the Ferdinand had one because their role was to hang back and shoot enemy tanks from afar. That's what the big gun is for. And in doctrine, the tank destroyer was supposed to be employed defensively to stop enemy armored breakthroughs. The problem only comes when they're instead used as breakthrough vehicles because Germany doesn't have enough tanks for the Citadel offensive, and they're shoved into a totally different role than what they're designed for. If the people making design decisions knew this was going to happen, I'm sure they would have added a machine gun. That said, the impact of not having one mounted at Kursk is still probably overstated. After the fighting around Ponyuri ended, a Red Army commission from 2 Soviet proving grounds cataloged the knocked out tanks left on the battlefield, noting the reason for their loss if it could be identified. According to their data, the vast majority of Ferdinands were lost to mines and artillery. Of those, one was sabotaged by its crew before being abandoned, and one was recovered and cannibalized for spare parts. 2 bogged down and couldn't be recovered, 2 were knocked out by direct hits, 263 by an incredibly lucky shot to an open driver's hatch while it tried to tow another Ferdinand, and 701 to a 203mm shell through either the side or the top. 1 was lost to an engine fire, 8 vehicles' primary loss reason couldn't be clearly determined, and lastly, 1 Ferdinand, hull number 333, was captured with its crew completely intact by Soviet infantry. 724, an artillery knockout, also had its crew captured, and 2 more were noted as being overrun by infantry without mentioning the fate of the crew. Being generous, that comes to 4 Ferdinands lost from a lack of a close defense weapon, putting it 4th on the list of loss reasons. Were there additional casualties taken by fleeing crews or recovery attempts failed because there was no machine gun to fend off enemy infantry? I wouldn't be surprised, and 100% once the army knew how they planned to use this thing, a machine gun should have been added. My point is, instead of a catastrophic mistake that just has no explanation, I feel like the machine gun thing is more of a bureaucratic oversight that's been overemphasized for the last 80 years. Also, I'm going to mention the name change here because I don't know where else to put it. On May 1st, 1944, the Ferdinand's name was changed to Elefant, and that has nothing to do with the refit. It was a completely administrative name change because Hitler thought it sounded cool and told the OKH to make it official. I'm going to call them Elephants from here on through because I don't want to interrupt what I'm talking about later, but just so you know, that's when and why it happened. January 22nd, the Allies landed at Anzio, 50 kilometers south of Rome, behind the main German defensive line in Italy. The OKW, sent into a minor panic, went looking for any units that could reinforce Italy, and the 656th happened to be one of the few available. The 216th Battalion was immediately detached and sent south, effectively disbanding the regiment, and 653's refit was accelerated. Mid-February, though, it was decided to send the first batch of 11 completed vehicles of the 1st Company 653rd Heavy Tank Destroyer Battalion to Italy right away under the command of Lieutenant Helmut Obrucht. This was 3 vehicles short of the company's full strength, but deemed acceptable given the situation, and on the 16th, the Elephants of 1653 were loaded onto rail cars for the journey south to the Italian front. Obrucht's understrength company arrived in the frontline town of Cisterna February 29th, and were immediately thrown into haphazard assaults at the American line defending the Anzio beachhead. The attacks were complicated by almost constant rainfall that made the ground extremely muddy and directly contributed to the first elephant loss of the campaign. March 1st, Elephant 114 is the lead vehicle in an assault by Kampfgruppe Stein towards the village of Isola Bella. While trying to turn around at a destroyed bridge, 114 slipped off the road and bogged down after jamming a track. With no recovery vehicles around, a Tiger from Heavy Tank Battalion 508 moved up to try and tow the Elephant, but came under heavy fire from US tank destroyers. This not only made recovering 114 impossible, but caused damage to the Tiger tank as well, and both vehicles had to be abandoned under fire. That night, the crew returned with combat engineers for a second go at recovering their Elephant, but before even reaching the vehicle were spotted and hit by artillery. 1 crewman was killed, and 114 was left to the Americans, who later pushed it off the road during their advance. The next day, in an assault to establish a bridgehead over Femnemorte Creek, Elefant 131 is disabled by a mine while turning onto the Via Aprila Road. U.S. artillery fire forced the maintenance section to abandon their recovery effort, and that night, under the cover of darkness, the crew returned and blew up the vehicle. After that debacle, Elefant 111 hit another mine in almost the exact same spot, but was successfully recovered and put back into action. After 1 temporary and 2 total losses in just 2 or 3 days, Olbricht's company was moved to the rear as a reserve March 3rd, right as German offensive actions around Anzio were halted. With both sides in a defensive posture, 653's section of the front was relatively quiet for the next 2 months, although their vehicles would take part in the regular exchange of artillery shells from time to time. May 19th, though, all of that changed, as the Allies began throwing an incredible amount of ordnance at the German lines, signaling an imminent breakout from the Anzio beachhead. In preparation, Olbricht's Elefants were positioned along Highway 7 north of Cisterna to defend the route to Rome. This move would really mark the beginning of a rapid end for the tank destroyers of 1653, as once the breakout began, May 23rd, the Allied offensive, Italian terrain, and Porsche drive system would seemingly unite in the common goal of hunting down every elephant in the country. May 24th, while caught in the path of the U.S. 1st Armored Division's drive to cut Highway 7 and surround Cisterna, Elefant 102 is clipped by a shell that lodges fragments in the left drive sprocket. Later, while retreating east of town, the extra friction caused by the fragments while driving overstresses the engines and sets them on fire. The crew booby-traps the wreck with grenades before abandoning it in the face of the American advance. After Cisterna falls the next day, the Americans shift part of their offensive north up Highway 7, where Elefant 113 is lying in wait. Mid-morning, as the crew scan the horizon for signs of the enemy, their vehicle gets hit by multiple artillery rounds that kill 1 crewman and destroy the tracks before setting the vehicle on fire. The rest of the company begins a fighting retreat towards the town of Velletri, and once there, load onto trains for Rome. June 2nd, Field Marshal Kesselring orders a general retreat of all German forces to the north and for Rome, where the 653 motor pool is stationed, to be abandoned. As the maintenance and supply sections prepare to leave the city, they're hit by Allied dive bombers that destroy an ammunition carrier, multiple wheeled vehicles, and kill several personnel. Around this time, Olbricht makes the first of many requests to have his company transferred out of Italy, citing the Elefant's difficulty handling the terrain. June 5th, after barely making it out of Rome before the Allies liberated the city the previous day, Elefant 123 is destroyed by Allied aircraft while retreating up the Via Aurelia Road. American tankers would later use the wreck as a training target. June 7th, Elefant 121 is driving on 1 engine to a maintenance unit south of Orvieto, when the ancient Roman bridge they're crossing collapses and sends the vehicle tumbling down a 30-foot embankment. One of the impacts shears the main gun and crushes the commander behind the breech. Once his body is recovered, the crew blow up the vehicle. June 9th, British 8th Army soldiers discover Elefant 124 abandoned in Soriano as they liberate the town. The crew were attempting to fix a mechanical issue when the Allied advance forced them to leave in a hurry, not even burning the vehicle before they left. June 10th, Elefant 122 is hit by a bomb from a U.S. aircraft near Orvieto and set on fire. Further north the same day near Kool, Elefant 112 suffers a mechanical failure and is blown up by the crew. The wreck is later pushed off the road by the Allies as they advance. The remaining Elephants arrived at a relatively safe repair station June 14th, and Olbricht continued to ask the German High Command to withdraw what was left of his company from Italy. His request was eventually approved on June 26th, but the poor situation on the front prevented their departure to Austria until August 2nd. While the company took high losses in vehicles in Italy, the actual personnel losses were, again, relatively low thanks to the protection of the Elefant's armor. Olbricht's men would spend the rest of the war as Jagdtiger crews on the Western Front, and their 2 surviving Elefants were quickly repaired and sent east to reinforce 653's other 2 companies that had been fighting in Ukraine since April. The refit of 653's other 2 companies was slower than hoped, as Newark was already at manufacturing capacity building Panzer IVs and had to expand their workforce before significant progress could be made. The battalion even requested test vehicles from Kummersdorf to try and fill out their rosters more quickly, although from what I can tell, Army Ordnance was still being incredibly petty and refused. For now. By the end of March, 30 of 31 Elephants had been handed over to their crews, which was deemed sufficient to deploy the brigade. And on April 2nd, 653 loaded onto trains for transport east to join Army Group South Ukraine. April 6th, the battalion arrived at the front, was attached to the 9th SS Panzer Division, ordered to establish a bridgehead over the Strypa River to relieve a German garrison surrounded at Tarnopol. However, the offensive ran into trouble almost immediately, as heavy rain the previous few weeks had turned the ground into impassable terrain for the 65-ton Elephants, and more than half broke down day one of the assault, trying to free themselves from the knee-deep mud. This would remain an issue for the rest of the operation. April 17th, a planned assault had to be outright cancelled because the Elephants couldn't make it to the starting line. Later, part of the battalion was able to assist in destroying a Soviet bridgehead over the Strypa River, and although they were unable to cross, repulsed multiple Soviet counterattacks and supported German assaults from the West Bank until mid-May. For the next 2 months, the front was fairly quiet, which allowed for major repairs to 653's Elephants that, after just 1 month in combat, were already in pretty bad shape. During this time, the brigade also collected several extremely unique vehicles, including a Porsche Tiger for use as a command tank sent from Germany, 2 T-34s converted into ammunition carriers, and another converted to a flak panzer, both done by the maintenance company, a Bergepanther converted into a command tank by welding on a Panzer IV turret, also done by the maintenance company, and 4 Elephants with 2-piece rear hatches delivered from Newark. Soviet offensives towards Army Group South ended the 8-week pause on the front July 13th. 653 was assigned to a heavy response force with 1 Tiger and 2 Stug brigades, and used to halt Soviet breakthroughs along the line. With their excellent gun and thick armor, the Elephants were able to blunt every offensive aimed at their stretch of the line, and inflicted heavy losses on Soviet armor. Breakthroughs further north, though, made 653's positions untenable, and in late July, the brigade began a long retreat west to Poland that cost them all of their ammunition carriers, the Command Tiger, 2 recovery tanks, and 22 tank destroyers, almost all to breakdowns. Personnel losses, though, were, again, very low by comparison. In Krakow, 2nd Company handed their remaining Elephants over to the 3rd, and the crews were sent back to Germany to join 653 to train on Jagdtigers. Around this time, the battalion also received the 2 Elephants that survived the fighting in Italy. With 14 Elephants, what was left of the battalion was deployed as a fire brigade at enemy breakthrough points through the fall and into the winter as the front moved west. In December, with less than 10 tanks left, the battalion was redesignated as Heavy Tank Destroyer Company 614 and remained at the front through January of 1945 before being taken off the line in preparation for what would become their final action of the war. Of the 90 Elephants built, 4 stuck it out through the battles, breakdowns, and 3 campaigns to go down with the ship at the very end. Arriving in Stahnsdorf, February 1945, the company reconstituted as best they could, and actually managed to scrounge the parts they needed to repair their vehicles. In April, they were attached to Kampfgruppe Maus and ordered south to Zossen to support Kampfgruppe Ritter. While loading onto rail cars at Mittenwalde, 1 Elephant broke down and had to be left behind. According to witnesses, it remained there for 2 years before being scrapped in 1947. Another took up a firing position at a road fork near Lopton, where it broke down before being abandoned. The final 2 Elephants survived to fight inside Berlin and were captured by Soviet and Polish troops May 1st, about a kilometer from the Reichstag. In the 80 years since the last Elephant became a wreck in the middle of Berlin that no one bothered to photograph for some reason, a lot of opinions on the wisdom of producing the Ferdinand and its value to the war effort have been given, mine included. so instead of adding to that again, I think the English translator of the combat history of German Heavy Anti-Tank Unit 653 summarized the entire Ferdinand story better than I could ever hope to in his note at the start of the book, saying, "Having served with heavy tanks for 9 years in the American Army, I was astounded at the similarities and the problems both our formations experienced. Like the Elephants, our M1A1 tanks could find very few bridges that would hold their weight, making for many tense moments with our backs to rivers with bridges we couldn't cross. I remember my command tank breaking through the crust of a dry lake bed during the Persian Gulf War and becoming mired in the slime below. When no other tanks or recovery vehicles could get close enough to tow us out, we connected several towing cables together and used a series of vehicles to drag the tank free. Another formation actually had to blow up one of its M1A1s when they were unable to recover it from another such lake bed. And this was during an overwhelming victory with complete air superiority. Maintenance problems are another similarity. Although our M1A1s were not underpowered, the jet turbine engine and transmission were very delicate and finicky devices. Any tank older than 2 years spent the majority of its time in the motor pool. But, just like the Elephants of World War II, the American heavy tanks performed magnificently in combat and could take a tremendous amount of punishment. Getting them to the front under their own power was an entirely different matter, however. It's very interesting how history repeats itself, despite great leaps in technology. Surprisingly, 2 of these things actually survived the war and are still around today. Ferdinand 501 was in the 1st Company Command Platoon of the 654th Battalion at Kursk when it hit a mine at Ponyary that destroyed the left track. Despite being set on fire to film battle scenes for Soviet newsreels, it was still in fairly good condition out of the ones that were left there, and became one of 4 that I'm aware of taken to Moscow for either evaluation by the Army or to be put on display. After the war, it was restored and is currently on display at Patriot Park in Moscow. Why 501 instead of 333 that was captured completely undamaged? I have no idea. After the Battle of Cisterna, Elefant 102 was taken to a collection point for captured enemy vehicles by the British 687th Heavy Recovery Section and was later shipped to Aberdeen Proving Grounds for evaluation. After the war, the Army Ordnance Museum left the one-of-a-kind vehicle out in the elements to rust for half a dozen decades, as is traditional in their circles. In 2008, it was finally restored on the show Tank Overhaul, during which the shell fragment lodged in the front left sprocket that probably caused the engines to overheat was found. From 2017 to 2019, it was displayed at the Tank Museum in the UK as part of a special exhibit with other Tiger variants, and today is housed in the US Army Ordnance Training and Support Facility in Virginia, which isn't open to the public, and at the moment is never planned to be. So, given current geopolitical tensions and US policy, Western Ferdinand enjoyers are kinda getting fucked here, but hey, maybe one day.